my very oldest and dearest friends, Jill and Jeremy Freedman, who in fact are the people who introduced me to Muswell Hill Synagogue many, many years ago. So this is very special for me. Rosa Freedman is a professor of law at Reading University. She's head of, I'll just look it up because I'll forget otherwise, the conflict. She's a professor of law and conflict and global development and director of the Global Development Division. She's been widely published. The list of publications seems enormously long and impressive to me, but that's probably because I don't know very much about this stuff. She focuses on human rights, and you've probably heard her talking by now at some stage about gender, about UN people working in Haiti and other countries. But this evening, she's not going to talk about those things. I'm sorry to disappoint you, Irene. She's going to talk about the first report presented to the United Nations on anti-Semitism, which she had a role in last year. And so with that, I'm going to say, welcome, Rosa, and over to
Hill Shaw for inviting me to speak about this topic. As Stephen said, I am a child of Muswell Hill Shaw. I grew up going there and enjoying it, despite the very cold toilets upstairs in the women's gallery. And over the years, even though we moved on to Norris Lee, we continue to go back to the Shaw and retain links with it. Today, I'm going to talk. When Stephen asked me if I would talk, there were many options of things I could talk about, but I'm going to talk about something that's very close to my heart and I hope is very close to all of your hearts. Certainly it's something that my mother has told me she is most proud of in terms of my work with the United Nations, and I can understand why she is most proud of it. Last year, the United Nations Special Rapporteur, which is an independent expert who's appointed by the UN to look at particular human rights issues around the world, the one who works on freedom of religion or belief, decided to write the first report on anti-Semitism as a human rights violation in the UN's history. And this report was the culmination of a year of research and work, and I was very privileged and very honoured to be invited by him to help with that work and help with the writing of the report. The report went to the UN General Assembly last autumn and went to the UN Human Rights Council a few months later. And really what I'm going to talk about today, or tonight, is the report itself, why it's so important, and what the findings are, which are instrumental really for us and for our community, but also for the world. Now, my dad always tells me that in these kind of talks, I should explain who I am and why I even have the legitimacy to have been part of writing that report. So as Stephen said, I'm a professor of law and I work at the University of Reading. My expertise is on the United Nations and human rights bodies. My PhD looked at the UN Human Rights Council, which many of you will know about because at the beginning of this body, nearly 15 years ago, it was accused of a huge amount of anti-Semitism and a huge amount of anti-Israel focus. My PhD then led to me working on other parts of the UN human rights system, including looking at accountability for when the UN itself commits human rights violations. When the UN Special Rapporteur, his name is Ahmed Shahid, he's from the Maldives, but he works at the University of Essex. When he was appointed to this mandate on freedom of religion or belief, he asked me whether I thought this idea of writing about anti-Semitism as a human rights violation could even get off the ground. And one of the reasons he asked that is because Jews generally have had such a poor relationship with the United Nations. We've seen the Zionism is racism resolution throughout the time of the United Nations. We've seen the UN being used as a vehicle to try and undermine the legitimacy of Israel, using anti-Semitism as a vehicle for that. And we have seen a huge amount of anti-Semitism throughout all of the UN human rights work. And I say that as a left-wing Zionist and someone who is a critic of Israel, much to my husband, who's on this Zoom, much to his disdain. But the reason why Dr. Shahid asked me whether we could even get this off the ground was that so many Jews are reluctant even to speak to United Nations experts or to United Nations bodies. And my response was, we have to try. We have to try because this is such an important issue in the world. And this issue is something that is growing and is increasing and needs to be addressed. So it was about 2 years ago now that we started looking at how we can view anti-Semitism as a human rights violation. Because, and I'm going to give you, for those of you that already know this, I'm sorry, I'm going to give you a little bit of background on what human rights actually are. After the Second World War and after the horrors, the atrocities perpetrated by Nazi Germany, the world wanted to say never again should a country be able to treat its citizens however it wants without it being against the law. Because what the Nazis did to German citizens, to Jews, to Roma, to people with disabilities, to gay people, to Black people, was not actually against the law. They could treat their citizens however they wanted to. So discriminating against them, killing them, perpetrating genocide was not against international law. What they did to Polish Jews, what they did to Russian Jews, what they did to Ukrainian Jews was against international law because countries weren't allowed to treat other people's citizens however they wanted, but they could do whatever they wanted to their own people. And that was the birth of the modern era of human rights. This idea that we're all born with certain rights, regardless of our race, our ethnicity, our sex, our class, or anything else about us. And those rights, like the right to not be tortured, the right to not have our life taken away from us by the state without due process, without judicial processes, those rights are our way as weak individuals to hold the big and powerful states to account. So this modern movement of human rights started after the Second World War. And by 1948, we had the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which sets out these fundamental rights that we're all born with by virtue of being born human. So we really think about and conceive of these rights as coming out of the ashes of Nazi Germany. And yet it took until last year for the UN to really think about Judaism, Jews, and anti-Semitism in terms of human rights, and to present this first report in terms of anti-Semitism as a human rights obligation. And one of the problems has been that anti-Semitism, on the one hand, falls within this idea of freedom of religion or belief. We Jews are a religious people, and so we have certain rights to practice our religion or belief. But anti-Semitism also falls within race and racism. And this idea that racial minorities ought to be protected from discrimination and other forms of human rights abuses. And so we kind of straddle these two lines, and we see this in the United Kingdom. We see this in terms of our schools and the cases to do with JFS and who constitutes a Jew for the purposes of going to a school. Is it a race or is it a religion? So it makes it quite a tricky issue, even if we take out all of the politics of the UN and Israel and Judaism. So when Dr. Shahid decided that he wanted to take on this report, he knew that it was going to be very difficult, both in terms of religion and race, and where does this fall within the human rights matrix? But it was also going to be very difficult in terms of the politics of the United Nations, because Israel is a highly politicized subject within the UN, and it's very difficult to talk about anti-Semitism without talking about Israel. So what I'm going to do in the next 20 minutes or so is give you probably an entire module that I would teach my students and try and draw out the key elements to it. So how does human rights work? With most parts of international law, governments agree to things with other governments as a kind of bilateral agreement. So they might agree to buy another government's apples for 30p if that government agrees to buy their cucumbers for 50p. And then they might agree with another government to buy their mangoes for £1 and another government to buy their bananas for 75p and so on and so forth until you get a spider web of these bilateral agreements between two countries. And if one country breaks their agreement, the rest of the spider web continues because it's still agreements between two countries. Where it comes to human rights, a country is agreeing on a unilateral basis. They are making a promise that they will not harm people within their control, normally within their country, within their territory. And if the UK says it will not torture people, it doesn't matter if Zimbabwe breaks its promise to not torture people. The United Kingdom still has to not torture people within its control. And because of that, it makes it a very special area of international law, because once a government promises to do something, it can't retreat from it no matter how other countries behave. And that means that many governments don't want to sign up to these pledges because then it will have to put lots of resources into behaving properly, and it will be held to account when it misbehaves. And in particular, it doesn't want to do so around small minority groups because who cares about them? They're not going to be able to have any particular impact in terms of voting or in terms of political lobbying within a member state. So my example is always, no government wants to say it hates children or it hates women because every country has lots of children and lots of women. But countries don't mind saying that they hate migrants or that they're not going to protect migrant rights because migrants often don't have a vote and people often are xenophobic and don't like migrants. So there's no particular impact on the government if they say we're not upholding those migrants' rights. One of the first things that we found where it comes to Jews is how many people think that we Jews are a huge lobbying group and that we number so many people in the world. If we go at the most conservative estimate of Jews based on Orthodox halakha, there are 14 million Jews in the world. If we go at the least conservative estimate of people who identify as Jewish, there are 23 million Jews in the world. There are 8 billion people in the world. We are a very small group and we are spread across 98 of the 193 countries in the world. We are not a big political lobbying group, and we do not have, even in the countries where we have huge numbers, we do not have huge impact or effect. 45% of Jews in the world live in the Americas, so in South America, in the United States, and in Canada. Just over 1 million live in Western Europe. There's just over 7 million in the Middle East and North Africa region, but most of those are in Israel. And there's about 350,000 in Eastern Europe. We did research, so when we started this report, we reached out to Jews across the world. And I was really privileged to sit in interviews and focus groups with Jews from Myanmar, or what some of you would call Burma, where there are 20 Jewish people. With Jews in Egypt, there are 8 registered Jews in Egypt, although there are probably many more, but Jews in Muslim majority countries often don't say to anyone that they are Jewish. We sat with Jews from Brazil, from Argentina, from Chile, Jews from really from across the world. And what we found was really different trends in terms of anti-Semitism that go on in those countries. But if we go back to what I was saying about how human rights law works, governments have an obligation not to violate, not to abuse the human rights of people in their territory. So we would traditionally think of anti-Semitism and government's obligations as governments need to make sure that we can practice being Jews. So we can have Brit Milah, we can have Shechita, we can have shuls and go and pray in those shuls, right? That government should protect our freedom of religion or belief. But there's another element in terms of anti-Semitism and government obligations, which is the racial side. So governments need to protect us from racism, from third-party actors, from individuals or from groups that live within their state territory. That means that they need to have laws that say that hate crimes are crimes. It means that when someone commits a hate crime, they need to be held to account. They need to be prosecuted, that there needs to be remedies, some form of justice for the victims. And so all the way through our consultations, we were looking at these two elements. On the one hand, could Jews practice being Jews in a country, and could they do it openly? And on the other hand, if Jewish people were being harmed because of their Judaism, because of the racial element of their Judaism, were the governments taking positive action either to prevent or to hold accountable those who were committing those crimes? And when I say that we saw different trends in different countries, it became apparent that there is nowhere safe to be a Jew. Now, I say this very reluctantly. My brother is on this call, and he and I have always had this joke that we sit down at Seder night and we talk about being a persecuted people while we sit in Hampstead Garden suburb eating a very nice Seder night in a very nice house until my parents moved to the countryside and therefore our Seder nights moved. Are we a persecuted people? On the one hand, no. We have so many freedoms within England. We have freedoms in terms of our education. There are no longer quotas about what clubs we can join, about what universities we can go to, about what schools we can attend. On the other hand, we are a persecuted people insofar as we are nomadic. But not only are we nomadic, we never feel that we belong. And the thing that really struck me and hit home of everything that I heard within these consultations was about the fact that we have to have security guards in our shuls and in our schools. Now, if you are in Holland, you have to have armed police on the shul in Rotterdam. You have to have armed police on the schools. If you're in London, you have to have CST and trained security guards. If you're in Turkey, you have gates which only open if the school bus flashes certain sort of it flashes the lights in a certain way, and that changes every single day. And the reason for that is in case someone has seen the flashing lights beforehand. If you're in Tunisia, you don't have your shuls or schools identified by anyone other than those who are Jewish and attend them as being Jewish at all. What struck me about these consultations is that in all 98 countries, there are some form of security measures, often funded by the government, right? The governments recognize that we need to have those protections. No other religious minority requires that in every country that they live in. Now, if you are a Hindu living in Pakistan, you might require that. But if you're a Hindu living in the UK, you don't. But the fact that Jews, no matter where we live, require some form of security, often paid for by the state, tells us that we are still a persecuted minority. Now, we might say, like my brother and I say, we're not persecuted if we compare ourselves with what our grandparents or great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents went through in Russia or Ukraine or Poland, or those who have grandparents who went through the Holocaust and went through the camps. But it's not normal. And yet we as a community have accepted this as normal. This is everyday practice that my child goes into school and says hello to security guards. No other child in this country does that. We also looked at trends. Sorry, I wrote notes for this talk, and being me, I've completely ignored all those notes. But I'll go back a little bit. Anti-Semitism is the oldest form of hate. And anti-Semitic narratives can be traced back to theologies that come from three triangulated positions. The first one is from religious theologies, which started with Christianity, the blood libels, the Jews having collective guilt for killing Jesus, and those theologies have spread now to radical Islam, right? We also see anti-Semitism in terms of the far right and neo-Nazis. These often draw on Christian tropes about the Jews controlling the media, controlling the world, the blood libels. But they also equate Jews and anti-Semitism with Jews trying to kill off the white people, trying to kill off the white ethno-state by bringing feminism in, by bringing anti-racism in, these ideas being apparently designed to dilute the world of white people. And then we have now the far left tropes, which also, again, draw back on Christian tropes about Jews controlling the media, Jews controlling the money, but are centered on Israel and Israeli government policies, but say that all Jews collectively are responsible for Israeli government policies. And this is really crucial, that final bit about the far left in terms of human rights, because under international human rights law, all people have the right of self-determination. This was a way of countering colonization, that instead of people being able to be ruled over by the UK or by France or by Portugal going in and taking resources and running the governments and so on, that all people have the right to determine who would rule over them. And the far left anti-Semitism comes out by saying that all people have the right of self-determination, the right as a nation to determine who governs over them and to have a piece of land. Everyone has that right apart from the Jews. And that's why the boycott and divestment and sanctions people, even though they have very legitimate criticisms of Israel, when they say that their aim is to end the state of Israel, their aim is to say that all people have the right of self-determination except for Jews. Jews are special and different, and they shouldn't have the right to determine who governs over them, and they shouldn't have the right to their own country. And it's much more difficult to spot far left anti-Semitism. Far right anti-Semitism is clear, right? It's hatred of Jews, and it's saying that Jews are out to destroy all white people and that Jews are responsible for all bad in the world. And radical religious, whether it's Christian or Muslim, anti-Semitism is also quite, it's quite obvious, it's quite in your face, it's the old tropes, it's what we saw in Poland about 18 months ago, where they took the effigy of a Jewish person and burned it during the Easter parades. It's about 2 years ago now, because it's the Jews that killed Jesus, and now let's burn all the Jews. And my husband goes to Poland once a year with the school, and they have the little anti-Semitic figurines being sold in the market. You can see those tropes. But the far left tropes are much more difficult to spot. And they are the ones that we see, unfortunately, because I still buy it, in the Guardian newspaper. They are the ones that we see through Jeremy Corbyn and through many of his supporters. They are the ones that look on the outside like, you know, they're just legitimate criticisms of Israel. So going back to the report, and sorry, my introduction has taken over most of the time of my talk. There were lots of regional trends that we saw, and lots of things that really concerned me. And I was someone that has always said, well, we Jews, we're okay. We looked at public attitudes towards Jews across the world. 55% of Polish people said they would not accept a Jew as a family member. 42% of Hungarians said they thought Jews held too much power over the worlds of finance and international affairs. The rise in neo-Nazi and right-wing political parties have been the source of a huge rise in anti-Semitic incidents, which we've seen, for example, in Hungary. We've seen recently in terms of the media in Hungary, the last independent and effective functioning media outlet has now been overtaken. We saw the law in Poland that was written in 2018 that criminalized anyone that said that the Poles had any part to play in Holocaust history in terms of Jews, and a similar provision in the Ukraine. We saw Jewish university students in the United States and Canada and Western Europe who increasingly say that they experience hostility, and most recently in Essex University, where Jewish students tried to open up a Jewish society, which was met with a protest and hostility, with members of staff saying that opening up a Jewish society was Zionist and was anti-Palestinian, and led to a member of staff being suspended and disciplined for equating Jews and Israel. We receive many reports from Jews in the Middle East and North Africa where they say that they are frequently conflated with Israel and Zionism, even in countries like Morocco, which are very open to having Jews and to its Jewish heritage. We saw in countries like Indonesia that 55% of students said that Jews are the enemies of Islam. We've seen many violent anti-Semitic attacks over recent years, including in Pennsylvania, where a gunman attacked the Tree of Life Synagogue, And his comments during the attack revealed the host of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that came from neo-Nazi ideology. We saw in April 2019 a similarly motivated attack in California. In France, much closer to home, we've seen violent attacks and murders in kosher supermarkets, in a Jewish day school. Similarly, in Denmark, in Copenhagen, outside a shul where a bat mitzvah was being celebrated, there was multiple attacks, including on a volunteer security guard. We've seen similar attacks in Bulgaria and in Mumbai. We know that in countries like Tunisia, countries like Morocco, people do not wear kippot, people do not wear a Magen David, people do not show outwardly that they are Jewish. And when we asked them, they said if they did, they would be terrified of physical attacks on their personhood. There have been many attacks on cemeteries, a terrible attack that we heard about in Iran, about the ripping up of Sifrei Torah, terrible attacks that we heard about in Tunisia, about graffitiing and attempted arson on shuls. The issue here, where it comes to human rights law and the obligation of governments, is not that governments are responsible for these acts of terrorism, but governments are responsible for holding to account the people who perpetrated them. And very often governments will have been told about, or will have had information through the security services about online activity, and yet done nothing to prevent these attacks on people going about their practice of their religion. So one of the key things that we focused on in the report was about how governments can look at online websites like Twitter, like Gab, and see that the vast majority of English language hate crimes there are focused on Jews. And given how small, as I told you earlier, the Jewish population is, it seems almost ridiculous that the majority of online attacks are perpetrated against our community. And we've seen this most recently in the last few days by a grime star, which is similar to rap, who spent 48 hours, a UK rapper, spent 48 hours tweeting hatred about Jews. But it's not just that he tweeted that hatred, it's how many other musicians then supported him in doing so. And the fact that Twitter did not close it down, whereas if that had been anti-Black racism, there would have been widespread condemnation. One of the other things that we picked up on is how difficult it is for Jews in many countries to practice their religions, and how we can almost understand that that might be the case where there's a small Jewish population. But in Western Europe, in countries like Norway, there have been attempts to ban shechita, ritual slaughter of animals. There's been attempt after attempt in Germany, with its history in terms of anti-Semitism, to ban circumcision. And Jewish communities reported in that they feel that they are under wave after wave of attack on ritual practice and on their ability to practice their religion in a way that other communities are not facing. So, lessons learned. I think what I found most shocking is the way that many of us have to live compared with our neighbours. What I found most shocking is that it's not just the Jews in the UK or in France or in Argentina, but it's Jews all over the country, all over the world, that have to think about how to practice Judaism, what to tell to their neighbours, what to show in terms of outward symbols, in a way that I've not heard from other minority groups in my work with the UN human rights experts. What also stands out to me is how many governments don't understand what anti-Semitism is. And so they don't understand what their obligations are. They might understand that Jewish schools are under attack, so they want to post armed policemen outside of them, and that's to be commended. But they don't understand that education is key, and then unless they educate and make sure that textbooks in Saudi Arabia or in Indonesia don't blame Jews for everything, that if they don't start young, then actually by the time that these young people in schools get to adulthood, it's going to be very difficult to persuade them not to commit anti-Semitic attacks. They don't understand their obligations around Holocaust denial, or their obligations to not equate Israel and Judaism. And that isn't to say that the governments themselves are anti-Semitic. Is actually, we are a tiny population, and many of these governments simply don't understand what Jews are. many of these government officials themselves have received poor education and do equate Israel and Jews. And so the recommendations of the report are absolutely key. The UN Secretary General has taken up some of them. We're hoping that there will be a change. And from my perspective, I'm also hoping there'll be a change in the way that we as a community view the UN, and that this will be the start of a re-engagement of Jews with the UN and with the UN human rights bodies, because it's only through us feeding in our perspective that the UN can change anything in terms of the tools that it has. So I've probably talked over my time there, Stephen and Rabbi David, but I'll hand it back over to you.
Thank you, Rosa. Thank you very much indeed. I've got quite a few questions for you. I'll start with a fairly broad one from Irene, who asks, are we ever going to be able to reform the UN Human Rights Council to get it to perform and be seen to perform the vital function that is so needed?
I mean, that's a great question, and I would refer you to my 120,000 word PhD. I mean, the answer is that the UN Human Rights Council is an intergovernmental body. So there are 47 of the 193 UN member states that sit on the body, and that rotates every year. And it's really there as a political forum. I don't think that we need to reform it in terms of Israel. I think that as a political body, we expect there to be politics involved. What we need to do is feed in more information about Israel, about Palestine, about Jews, about anti-Semitism, so that there will always be a few countries that sit on the body that are very anti-Israel. There will always be a few countries that are very anti-Semitic. But the vast majority of them don't actually care that much about Israel or that much about Jews one way or the other. But they learn the information from those who lobby them. So the more effective our lobbying is of providing transparent and effective information, the more nuanced the discussions will be. But certainly since the body started in 2006, when there was a hugely disproportionate focus on Israel, we've seen massive changes. And actually now, yes, there still is a disproportionate focus, but I wouldn't say it's gross and egregious in the way that it was when the Human Rights Council first started. And part of that has been the pressure from countries like the United Kingdom and the United States, who have said that they will pull out of the council if it continues to focus so much attention on Israel and so little attention on other abuses elsewhere.
Okay, so I hope that satisfies you, Irene. I think we'll say the jury's out on that one. I've got a question here. I'm just trying to think how to phrase this as a question rather than a statement. Some universities reserve places for minority groups, and yet Jews don't fall into the criteria for those minority groups. So, and I wonder if you've got a comment on that.
Sorry, can I just clarify what you mean by minority groups and what kind of places are reserved for them?
Gillian, can you unmute and perhaps explain that question?
Okay, if a Jewish student applies to study a particular discipline that's very popular, it could be medicine or dentistry or law, or something like that, the applicant will be told that these places are being reserved for people from minority or underprivileged groups, and that this student belongs to a privileged majority group, and therefore isn't eligible. I mean, it's certain universities possibly more than others, but you know, students sometimes have to wait another year to get into university because of this.
I mean, I obviously work in a university. I'm not one of the admissions officers in a university, but the only minority group that I've ever heard of is having two groups potentially that have specific places. allocated for them. One is for refugee students from the local population, totally fine. There are additional places. They are not coming out of regular places. And I hope that all of us would feel very strongly that if a young person has come out of an internally displaced persons camp in somewhere like Syria and has managed to get the grades to come to the university, I certainly want them to, and they're usually funded by the university and by alumni. And the other is that there's sometimes, it's not that they are reserved for students, but students, say with disabilities, might be given lower offers to reflect the fact of how they've done. I have not heard of any other minority groups, any other form of positive discrimination within universities that I've worked in. That doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, but I suspect that I mean, I'd be interested to hear potentially further as to how this works, but I think quotas were done away with in higher education sector quite a long time ago, and it's not something I've heard of, so it's not something I feel comfortable responding to without more information.
Okay, I got a question here for you, Rosa, which is talking about this guy Wiley, who I'd never heard of before 2 or 3 days ago, which just shows my age, I suppose. Where is the line between deeply offensive free speech and hate crimes or hate speech? I mean, how do you draw that line? And adding in from me, because we as Jews can be oversensitive, I suspect.
I mean, I think it's a really difficult one because, and I was talking to a friend about this the other day before everything to do with Wiley. What you need to have is an underlying crime. So if someone spray paints F off on a door of a building, right, that's a crime. It's criminal damage, right? It's property damage. If they spray paint F off you effing Jew on the door of a shul, then it's property damage that's aggravated by hatred of Jews, right? So it's a hate crime. What happens online is very different, because is it a crime to say I dislike someone? Not necessarily, and you're not spray painting it, but the incitement that Wiley has done, the incitement to hatred, to hatred based on race here, racial hatred of Jews, is itself a specific crime. And then I've now forgotten your question because I've just answered one aspect of it, but
are we overly sensitive?
I don't believe we are. I mean, I think before I started working on this report, I was very much shrug your shoulders. Okay, someone yells at you effing Jew as you walk down the street, which someone did to our 10-year-old, then 10-year-old, when he was out scootering on our road one Shabbos. The 2 kids walked past him and a friend and shouted, "You effing Jews." And on the one hand, we talked to him about it. And on the other hand, I thought to myself, well, you know, he lives in a country where no one's going to beat him up or blah, 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 at this age for scootering in Kippur and Sitza on Shabbat. After this report, I think that actually we're not too sensitive to it, because we're living in a world of, say, Black Lives Matter movement. And if we would turn around and say that it's okay, the amount of racial hatred towards Black people online, we would be rightly accused of racism and insensitivity. And yet, I think in many ways we have been taught to swallow down what happens to our community, because it's not pogroms. It's not what our fellow Jews are going through in Tunisia or Egypt. It's not concentration camps. And so we kind of swallow it down. But we forget the massive impact that this has on desensitizing many people online from anti-Semitism, but also legitimizing people's anti-Semitic thoughts. There's meant to be a Twitter blackout for 48 hours from Monday, people standing with Jews and saying to Twitter, it's not okay that you have not banned this person for inciting racial hatred against Jews. It's really good to see non-Jews standing up and saying this. It was really good for me to see how many of my non-Jewish colleagues stood up around not Jeremy Corbyn himself, but around many of his supporters who used that platform for anti-Semitism. But I think that we, in many ways, in many ways, we are the opposite of oversensitive. Many ways, certainly people like me on the left sort of say, well, let's just push it down because, you know, our politics say we still want that government. We still want to be aligned with the left. We don't want to make a fuss. We're still here as guests in someone else's country. All of those things come together.
Okay. You probably knew you weren't going to get away without being asked a slightly off-topic question. So Lawrence and Deborah Cohen said, Rosa, thank you for your talk, very nice. On a different note, can we ask about your views on the trolling of J.K. Rowling?
Sorry, you can't hear me. You can't hear me laughing. When I agreed to do this talk, I had a nice chat. We were really privileged and fortunate, and I say this to everyone, to have spent a good 3 months of lockdown on a small holding with plenty of room to walk and plenty of fresh eggs and vegetables. And I was with my parents and my husband and my son and my cousin when this invitation came in. And Stephen, you very kindly said I could talk about anything, and it was immediately vetoed, and rightly so, by all my family, that I talk about the sex and gender debate, because that's basically been everything that I've talked about for the last 2 years. So I would politely say to whoever asked that question, I would be delighted to talk about it, not right now, but I would be delighted to talk about it by email or by Zoom or by WhatsApp. But out of respect for my parents and my husband who are on this call, I'm not going to talk about it now.
Fair enough. Well played, Rosa. Nice deflection. Sorry, Lawrence. A certain Jeremy Friedman wants to know what percentage of Jews wouldn't accept a Pole as a member in their family. I'm not sure that you'll have that one.
Dad, I'm not sure, but I can go back through the data and have a look, because we certainly have good surveys on that. I would hope that it's the same number, but I suspect it's not.
Somebody here has asked, please ask Rosa, how many UN governments truly and effectively incorporate the decisions of the Human Rights Commission in their legal systems?
Okay, so here, this is where it becomes tricky. International human rights obligations are legal and they're legally binding on countries, but you can't put a country in prison, you can't send the bailiffs around to a country. It's very difficult to enforce human rights obligations against a country. Now, in Europe, we have the European Court of Human Rights, and if you are a small country, you might feel under political or peer pressure to uphold a ruling. If you're the UK, well, we had this ruling about prisoners having the right to vote. They have the right to vote according to the European Court, but we've still not implemented that within our system, and we can see why, and part of that is the lack of any kind of respect for European systems as shown by Brexit. So where it comes to UN human rights systems, there's even less kind of political pressure that can be placed on countries to listen to the rulings of the semi-judicial bodies like the UN Special Rapporteur that I worked with, or the treaty bodies. The UN Human Rights Council is a political body only. It's government, and it doesn't present any human rights rulings at all, because if it did, then those rulings would change according to the different governments that are sitting on the body at any time. It's just a political pressure group, a bit like the UN General Assembly. So it will do lots of things to do with building capacity for human rights, building understanding of what human rights are, doing fact finding, having panels, having information sharing. But it doesn't make rulings on human rights, which is why it can say all the things that it wants to about political situations without its pronouncements being legally binding.
Okay, which leads to, I guess, a question that several people have asked. Let me just find it. Do you have any hopes that China can be brought to book in international law for its human rights abuses? And I think the answer is, from what you just said, it's not going to be in international law.
Look,
with reference to the Uyghur.
I could talk about this for quite some time because I find it deeply distressing and concerning. China is one of the countries that is very anti-human rights because China says we shouldn't have any interference in the way a state conducts itself within its own territory, right? So there are two approaches to human rights. There are those countries that say there are some things like torture or extrajudicial killing that supersede, you know, a country's ability to rule over its own territory. And there are other countries that say, no, state sovereignty, a country's ability to rule over its own territory is sacred. And countries like China or India that believe that it can do anything within its own territory that it wants to are very anti this human rights project. And they've made that clear from the start. It's not a secret. It's something that they've always said. Now, China gets very angry when anyone wants to interfere with how it treats minorities because it says, this is our country, we can do what we want. If people don't like it, they can leave. Now, they ignore the fact that people might be too poor to leave. They might have nowhere to go, but they say there are no overriding morals and ethics. And they often use the term neo-colonial tool of oppression. China will say, this is just the West imposing its morals and its standards on our country through this lens of human rights. But if we think about it from a more sort of geopolitical point of view, China has the military, it has the economy, it now has the soft power through building pavements and banks and all sorts in Africa to create this kind of soft power lens. So who's going to fight against China? Who's going to turn around to China and say, what you've been doing in Tibet, what you've been doing in Taiwan, what you've been doing to the Uyghurs, what you're doing in terms of your own people are human rights violations? Because where we think about smaller countries or countries that are dependent on international trade or international aid, there are sticks and carrots and ways of saying, if you're not compliant with certain human rights, we won't work with you. But with China, unless we all collectively say we're going to pay more money for our Coca-Cola because we're going to get our Coca-Cola in plastic bottles that are in factories where people have minimum wages being upheld and where people have basic labor standards being upheld, and we don't mind paying £3.50 for our Coca-Cola bottles, not 99p, right? Unless we all decide to do that, China holds the power. So we think about the UN and what can the UN do about China? It's not the UN, it's what can we globally do about China and about, you know, what are we globally doing about the fact that there is going to be a World Cup held in Qatar where we know that people have been literally dying to build those stadiums, where people have been held in modern day slavery, and yet we all seem to love football so much and we're going to completely ignore that and allow the World Cup to go ahead, forgetting that it's we the people. The UN Charter says we the people, and yet we do nothing about these issues.
Ooh. Okay, well, that's a really thought-provoking way to bring this to a close, I think. Yes, I'm going to wrap it up there, and I'm going to ask everybody to unmute themselves. Please unmute and give Rosa a big round of applause. Rosa, that was a really great way to finish, with a challenge to all of us, rather than leaving human rights as solely the province of the United Nations.